I rise to support Amendment 214, to which I've attached my name. I'm not sure if attaching my name to an amendment makes it more or less likely to be considered. I think perhaps less likely. No. I think this is a quite important amendment, and I hope your Lordship's House will forgive me if I restate things slightly differently, because in my political life I have found that it pays to repeat things, because people don't always hear them the first, second or even 100th time. So repetition is not a bad thing. This amendment is all the more important when considered in light of the Prime Minister's hard truth Brexit speech, where she has committed to bringing our country back together, taking into account the views of everyone who cares about Brexit from both sides of the debate. Very laudable, because we all know that this country is deeply divided over Brexit, and we have to, at some point, start some healing. I haven't seen any sign of it yet. And so this amendment is a chance to start that healing process and to reassure people who are anxious about the prospect of leaving the EU, and that number seems to mount every day. So Amendment 214 sets out a legal responsibility for ministers to ensure that public authorities continue to protect all rights, freedoms and protections that any person might reasonably expect as a member of the EU. Ministers are claiming a whole load of law-making powers in this bill, but this amendment will require them to use those powers for good. We're retaining this whole body of EU law with certain rather crucial gaps, but we really don't want a governance gap where many of our rights could be contingent on some power or function exercised by an EU authority, an EU entity, which we don't have a copy of. As one example, so many of our environmental protections and the protection of our health that stems from them are currently governed by EU entities. And so these retained EU laws will be absolutely worthless if there's no organisation, entity through which they can be held to account and to take effect. And while ministers will have legal powers under this bill, far more if they get their way, of course, than we really want them to, they have no legal obligation to ensure that those powers are used to protect our rights. So there's a very big gap through which so much retained EU law could fall without this amendment. And as worrying as the Henry VIII powers are, the potential to lose rights by omission is just as worrying. As someone who voted for Brexit, I know that no one voted to lose their rights, their protections, their freedoms. With this amendment in place, I know that I certainly would sleep better at night. And many more people, Brexiters, Remainers, don't carers, I'm not sure how many of those there are left, but perhaps there are, and whoever else would feel reassured about the path that Brexit is taking us on. We all know that Brexit is a leap in the dark. None of us can say how this will fall out. But this amendment is our opportunity to actually put some certainty in place by requiring the government to ensure that all rights, freedoms and protections that we currently enjoy under the EU will continue to be protected by a public authority once we leave. Now, I'd quickly like to take a moment to preempt the Minister, who is going to say lots of things I won't agree with probably, but by briefly explaining what this amendment is not. So in case you have a lot of rights that you're going to throw back and say things like voting in EU elections, standing for elections to the EU Parliament and so on, this is preempted by the amendment, which only refers to those rights which do not cease as a result of the withdrawal agreement. So we can save ourselves from that response. The withdrawal agreement will be voted on by this Parliament, so there will at least be some democratic basis on which those rights are withdrawn. This is in contrast to the rights withdrawn by omission, which has no democratic mandate, scrutiny or oversight. So I beg the Minister to give real thought to the intent of this amendment. As I said, no one voted to lose their rights, and I think that the majority of people in this country would actually support this amendment and not see it as any measure that will in any way block Brexit. It is about protection for us all. It's our chance to put things right and start that healing process that I think is absolutely necessary, and not just necessary but urgent.